Good evening. It's about 6:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us tonight. And as you can see, we have a special guest, Blake Barbaree of Point Blue Conservation Science. My name is Kayla Henry. I am part of our outreach team here at Great Basin Bird Observatory. There's a good chance most of you attending tonight are familiar with our organization, but for anybody new, Great Basin Bird Observatory is a nonprofit of scientists dedicated to furthering bird conservation in the Great Basin and beyond. And we do this through research, partnerships, and education, and that includes hosting webinars like this. So before we get into tonight's presentation, I just wanted to quickly tell you all about a few events we have coming up on the horizon. For those in the Reno area, we are hosting a presentation tomorrow night at Pigeon Head Brewery. We will have Madeline Lohman of UNR, who will present some of her research on waterfowl in the prairie pothole region of the Northern Great Plains. And we're pretty excited to have her and also to get together in person for those of us who can. This weekend, we are hosting 2 field trips. Saturday kicks off our Birding by Ear series at the Evans Canyon Trailhead here in Reno. This will be with our biologist and outreach coordinator, Ned Bowman. And this will be a recurring event every 3rd Saturday of each month through April. On Sunday, Ned will also be hosting a Gull ID session at the Sparks Marina. Next Tuesday, we will continue our January lecture series via webinar with presentations from GBBO's Ned Bowman and Birding Las Vegas guide Alex Harper to discuss the silver state of birds. On January 31st, we will conclude our lecture series with a presentation from Becky Lausch with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. This is on Motus tagging and white-faced ibis. And you can visit our upcoming events calendar for more information. That is gbbo.org/events. And for tonight's presentation, we are so excited to host Blake Barbaree, who is the senior waterbird ecologist with Point Blue Conservation Science. And they're here to share with us a 30-year perspective on shorebird populations in the Intermountain West. Prior to joining Point Blue in 2012, Blake spent 10 years studying avian ecology in California, Oregon, and Alaska. Since joining Point Blue, their career is focused on advancing the conservation of migratory shorebirds and their habitats. And this includes coordinating both the Pacific Flyway Shorebird Survey and the Intermountain West Shorebird Survey to support international climate smart partnerships. And they do so much more than that. So Blake lived in California for over 10 years while working for Point Blue and now resides in Tucson, Arizona. And with that, Blake, welcome and thank you for being here tonight. And I will now turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Kayla. Let me get screen sharing going. So give me just a minute to make sure we can all be on the same page here. Okay, do we see the Intermountain West Shorebird logo?
Yep, looks good.
Got it. Great, thanks. Awesome. Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Kayla. I really appreciate the opportunity to present some of this work to you all. And the title of the talk today is 30-year perspective on Intermountain West shorebirds. And just to tell you to start off, this is still very early in this program. So I'm really going to give you a lot of background on this large program that we're still building out with a massive partnership network across interior portions of the West. So we won't really have many results, and hopefully I can come back in a couple of years and add in some context of what we've been finding over the next few years. So first, I often like to start off just a little bit about what makes me tick and where I've come from and how I've really been inspired by nature and birds and the drive that it takes to push forward conservation. And it really boils down to just like the simple things and moments and gratitude and trying to be humble and really observing nature and all of its behaviors and quiet and loud times and often just being in awe of the animals and plants that surround us. So for me, I've actually grew up really most of my childhood in rural New Mexico. And from there, I've lived in a lot of places. This is me as a kid, just playing with chickens, my first bird love. And honestly, I didn't really even totally get into birds until I was probably an undergraduate in college. But always had a love for being outside and the drive to be outside. And from my childhood in New Mexico, lived in many different states since then, in part for wildlife work and also in part growing up and moving around in a few different states. But overall, I've really come now almost full circle back to Arizona after living for a while in the East, growing up, and then working, as Kayla mentioned, in Alaska and Oregon and California, and now many other states across the Western US, really focusing on shorebird and waterbird research and monitoring. And this year actually will be like 20 years since my first job in wildlife. So celebrating that little anniversary there of being really, really focused on understanding the movements of bird populations and understanding their distributions across different habitat types. So briefly also about Point Blue, where I've worked now for over 10 years. Our organization was founded in 1965, so well over 55 years ago, as Point Reyes Bird Observatory. And I'll touch a little bit on that, of some of the old work that we're recreating with this new program. And we have now actually over 180 seasonal and full-time staff that are working to reduce the impacts of environmental change and promote nature-based solutions for wildlife and people. A good portion, the vast majority of our work is in California. Much of our migratory bird work is more Pacific flyway level. We do work in Antarctica. We also have work around restoring watersheds with school children and a handful of different programs across our organization. So please do check us out on the web. So I will also say I'm a scientist, so forgive any jargon, and I'll try and keep things as simple as we can. Overall, though, I want to give you a little outline of the talk tonight, and really my goal for being here, and it's really introducing this massive new program that we're developing with the National Audubon Society, and give you an idea of the background, why we're undertaking this massive effort, some of the objectives, some of the methods of how we're actually going about documenting shorebird distributions across a vast landscape, and then some opportunities to potentially help us. I will also touch on our first survey that happened back in August 22 and some preliminary results of that. So now I'll jump in. I always start my introduction of this program really zoomed out, because you have to think about migratory shorebird conservation. There's no bigger challenge to conservation of wildlife than creating conservation strategies that can cover two hemispheres. And in this case, many shorebirds are using 13 different countries across the Pacific coast of the Americas. So really being able to zoom all the way out and understand that many of these species we can't successfully conserve without working across many jurisdictions and nationalities. And these partnership networks are still growing, and we're really investing a lot more now into the Southern Hemisphere, because we know that all the investments and work that we're doing here in the Western United States can all be for naught for a lot of species if something down or up the line doesn't work for them. And so you see the scope of really what some of these birds are using. Of course, even phalaropes, that doesn't totally cover their interior areas in South America, but gives an idea of the whole scope of Pacific flyway shorebirds for the most part. And one thing that's unique about this picture here and interesting is that you see it's really focused on the Pacific coast. This is the Pacific America's Shorebird Conservation Strategy Plan area, which is a huge collaborative plan that was put together about 6 or 7 years ago, led by the National Audubon Society and many others. And you see the program area, it goes inland there in the Western North America, because we have this really unique network of saline lakes and freshwater wetlands that provide really key habitat for migratory shorebirds as an entire taxa, particularly during migration. We know it's really important breeding habitats for certain species, but from the shorebird taxa as a whole, super important for migration. These saline lake networks have been the backbone of their migrations, allowing them and bringing them inland in the spring and fall, and away from the coast because of these reliable food sources that these locations have been providing for millennia. That's changing a lot these days. And it gets a little bit into now really how we've gotten here today. And we know that essentially there's a really big data gap within this interior portion of the Pacific Flyway. It's got super important wetlands that are critical stopover sites, 6 Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network sites, many priority shorebird wetlands as well. And this effort began about in 2019 with an idea and recognition at the Pacific Flyway Non-Game Technical Committee, which is a committee under the Pacific Flyway Council, which is a venue where all the state wildlife agencies and federal wildlife agency management agencies across the Pacific Flyway gather to prioritize management strategies across the flyway. And within the context of the Pacific Flyway Council, one of the top priorities that was identified was a data gap within this Intermountain West region. There was no standardization of surveys, and the last comprehensive survey of the region that was at the regional scale, which is required for really understanding shorebird distributions, occurred 30 years ago. And that survey was led by Point Reyes Bird Observatory and some of my predecessors in the wetland ecology division at Point Blue. And that was actually part of the Pacific Flyway Project, which was the first real massive effort to document shorebird distributions across the flyway. And the interior portion of that was Intermountain West shorebird surveys, where they surveyed 162 sites during spring and fall to inventory shorebirds. What's really interesting about the timing of that as well is that a lot has changed since then, as from a shorebird and wetland habitat perspective. Not only has just before, in like 1985, I believe it was when the no net loss wetland policy was enacted in the U.S., which was essentially kicked off a new generation of wetland restoration. Those impacts hadn't been seen in 5 years after that policy. So now, 30 years from now, we have an opportunity to understand, have these big changes at both site, state, and regional levels had impacts for migratory shorebird distributions. We've also had a massive multi-decadal drought that we know that most of you are aware is stressing water availability for humans and wildlife across the West. Many wetlands have disappeared in the past few years, if not the past couple of decades. So massive declines in habitat for these birds. We also know better now. There's better science about the declines of shorebird taxa across North America, knowing that over the past 40 years, the shorebirds have declined as a taxa at a greater rate than any other bird taxa, in part because a lot of them are highly migratory. So I wanted to just touch a little bit on some of the results from the past survey. I won't dig in too deep here, but these are just some figures from the old surveys from 1989 to 1995 across Intermountain West. And this figure shows you the 38 sites out of the 162 that had at least one count of more than 1,000 shorebirds in total. So you can see many of the key sites. I think there's around 9 or 10 sites that are in Nevada, and this includes these really important wizard sites and some really massive sites. I'll show you in a minute. There's a pretty skewed distribution of birds among these sites, but 38 of the 162 had met this threshold of 1,000 shorebirds. So something we're interested to find out at the end of this program is what sites still meet those thresholds. And here, don't worry about all the information in this table, but down in the yellow gives you an idea of the magnitude of the numbers of shorebirds are actually counting across this region. And you see a median count of around 670,000 shorebirds and maximum counts in fall of around 922,000. In spring, quite a few less. Seasonally, this is another aspect of this original program, was just understanding how different it was between seasons. There wasn't a lot known about even seasonal variability 30 years ago. And they found, more than almost double the number of shorebirds were using these sites in fall as compared to spring. And you see around 271,000 for the median in spring versus 670,000 in fall. And we know that a lot of the drivers behind that are ecologically. These birds they're passing through quickly in spring, trying to get to the breeding grounds for the most part. And in the fall, not in a hurry, and many undergoing molt and staying for long periods of time at certain individual sites to molt their flight feathers. Some more results from the past surveys were that they found 10 of the 162 sites were really key important wetlands, these foundational sites that had over 10,000 shorebirds for their median count in fall. These sites, you can see them listed below. The Great Salt Lake having proportionally, the Great Salt Lake had more than 50% of all of these other sites combined. So there's definitely a disproportionate distribution among sites, with the Great Salt Lake holding huge importance to birds within the region. It's followed by the Salton Sea, which was by far the second highest abundance. Then also Mona Lake, Goose Lake, Lake Avert, Harney Basin, Summer Lake, Lake Lowell in Idaho, and then Nevada, also Lahontan Valley and Humboldt Wildlife Management Area. Some of the other lens that the past surveys really looked through were the species specific lens, and understanding distributions of the species across the sites, but then also between both spring and fall. And these maps just give an example of how they published the work. We'll do some similar maps that can allow for comparison to these past surveys and for communicating with everyone from different public to volunteers to decision makers. And you can see on the left, these are some of our common species where there's pretty widespread distribution at sites for blackneck stilts and killdeer. And then on the right here, some species that are less common and also more seasonal in their abundance, where we have Baird sandpiper having much higher abundance and a broader distribution in fall, as we know that they're move through in higher numbers in fall. And then also for the whimbrel, where we see much higher numbers in spring versus fall. So the old work was really laying the foundation for a lot of this knowledge that it is now more common knowledge today. So we're revisiting it now because we are having a much better recognition across the conservation community that shorebirds are these sentinels of environmental change. They're responding to habitat change at both local and then also vast landscape flyway scales. And this continued decline in freshwater has raised the alarm, and recent population estimates have confirmed those. We also know that really the annual cycle knowledge stream and framework for monitoring shorebirds of the Pacific Flyway right now is primarily focused on the coast. So we know that we're missing some key information on these sites, going back to the data gap that the Flyway Council had identified, and connecting into some of the current programs that Point Blue and partners run, the Pacific Flyway Shorebird Survey and the Migratory Shorebird Project, which now monitors Pacific Flyway shorebirds across all 13 countries of the Pacific coast of the Americas. But again, few inland sites across that entire network. This also really feeds into the Strategic Habitat Conservation Framework, which is applied by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and many state wildlife agencies in many ways. And this approach was really linking this site to regional approach to more hemispheric shorebird conservation initiatives. So the goals of this program are really feeding into some of the highest priorities of the Pacific America's shorebird conservation strategy and several other key conservation documents. So our overall goal is really to advance the conservation and management of these imperiled aquatic ecosystems of the Intermountain West, primarily focused on freshwater wetlands and saline lakes. And this information is going to be foundational for wetland conservation work over, we see, the next several years, if not several decades, and providing both feedback on if restoration activities have been successful at both site and regional and state levels, and then also informing prioritization of sites moving forward, because the relative importance of an individual site across Intermountain West has probably changed a lot in the last 30 years because there's not as many to choose from, and we're not sure how many birds relative to the past are actually moving through. And with that, it also feeds into some of the larger priorities right now around conservation of land at larger scales, in part related to like the 30 by 30 initiatives led by California and a few other states. But some of these larger scale land conservation initiatives are asking and for these type of data, because understanding migratory bird dependence on a site is a really challenging effort. So we'll get into how we do that a little bit. And really the overall goals of this program are comprehensively surveying shorebird sites of the Intermountain West. We're not going to be able to count all the birds, but we want to get to the sites that have the most importance and document all of the birds there. And as our baseline being the 162 sites from historic surveys, so we can compare today's efforts to those from 30 years ago. And this will allow us to quantify 30-year trends. We also want to bring in and identify both environmental and human-related factors that are driving those distributions. We know surface water distributions are going to be a huge part of that. So we'll work with the Intermountain West Joint Venture and their program to turn remotely sensed satellite imagery of surface water distributions into GIS layers, where we can then combine those with the shorebird data to not only understand how the birds changed, but also how has the habitat changed for them. We're also going to take the analyses to a little bit of a next level at the end of this program and use the information from these trend analyses at these different spatial scales at sites and states and across the region to inform future conservation actions. And some of those strategies are still being developed in the work plan for a postdoctoral researcher that we'll hire, will be developed in collaboration with the Pacific Flyway Council and all the 11 state agencies and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So all the state agencies across the West to develop those priorities. Timeline, really, this is a massive project, like a 7-year time frame, really, which doesn't fit into a typical project time frame because grants and funding opportunities are rarely that long. So we've kicked off essentially an initial phase of the program that I'm going to tell you more about today, and the results of at least our first amounts of surveys. That is getting us through essentially into this next year. And right now, as I'll mention in a minute, we are looking to secure funding for essentially our research phase, or phase 2 of this entire effort, that will take us through finishing our shorebird surveys and then also the scientific analyses and outreach and dissemination of our scientific results. So as you can see now with the second red arrow, we only got one survey in 2022 that I'll touch on, and we're hoping to have our new funding just later this year. And I'll jump a little bit into our methods at this point. And you can see we started with 162 historic sites. We've now identified an additional amount that brings us up to 208 different sites across 11 states. Sites can be as small as a little pond or a little reservoir, all the way to as big as the Great Salt Lake. So the variation in the size of the sites and the amount of people and work it takes to actually survey them is highly variable. But overall, we have a total of 288 sites that we plan to visit. And in part because we are expanding our survey region, the historic surveys from in the early 90s only covered the light gray portion on that map to the right. And we're expanding to the dark gray portion, and then also expanding surveys all the way out throughout Montana and New Mexico, as well as those states are interested in mapping their entire state for important shorebird sites. So expanding strategically in some other areas to help best inform management at the state level. Our overall approach is essentially a snapshot survey each migration. So we're going to coordinate one massive survey effort across the whole region each spring and fall. And we want to do that for at least 3 years. So at least 3 spring and 3 fall surveys at all of those sites. So we're looking at around 1,250 surveys minimum. It's actually going to be quite a bit more than that, because we'll be at 4, if not a little bit closer to 5 years of surveys at some of the sites by the time this is all said and done. As we know, in migration, bird abundance varies highly day to day, week to week. And so the approach to have one survey really gives us this broad snapshot lens that we can look at the distribution of shorebirds among sites. So in some sites, we will strategically conduct multiple surveys over the course of migration to get a better idea of turnover rates. But for this project, we have this one massive survey each spring and fall that requires us to know when, right? We need to know when is going to be the peak of the best time to survey. And the way we did that was to identify basically the peak in abundance for migrating shorebirds. We also looked at diversity as well, but I'll get into that in just a little bit of how we went about that. So we also needed to design shorebird surveys at all of these individual sites. A handful of the sites had ongoing work. It's probably about 20 to 30 of the 200 sites had some sort of ongoing survey. So where we can, we want to integrate with any ongoing work that was going on at the sites, create those partnerships, and figure out how we can integrate survey protocols. And we're working towards integrating these flyaway standards that are implemented across the population monitoring frameworks on the coast. And I'll get to a little bit of those details in a moment about how we did that. We also have an existing database that we're going to leverage for this program, which is a node of the Avian Knowledge Network. So we have an customized online portal for entering the shorebird survey data. The observer network for pulling off this massive survey is going to be, it's going to take an army, and about half of those observers will be volunteers. It will probably be around 40% professional biologists from staff directly contributing to this project, and staff across many different not governmental and non-governmental organizations will also be contributing. And then in addition to some of the Point Blue and Audubon staff. But a huge component of this is skilled volunteers helping us count shorebirds. So we have this community science aspect and an engagement aspect that goes to many different audiences, and all the participants are part of this massive network of surveyors. So I mentioned integrating some of the current flyaway standards, and when that gets down to the details of that, it's actually pretty challenging when we try to integrate those standards with standards from surveys 30 years ago, when the standard from 30 years ago was essentially count all the birds. And now we want to have something more rigorous and repeatable that's designed to a standardized methodology and standardized data flows. So to do that, we created a standardized survey protocol that was essentially a tiered protocol where we have 3 different tiers of methodology. And each tier builds off of the first tier, collecting a little bit of additional data. And essentially our first tier is our baseline survey effort, where we're trying to recreate that historic survey, get to the site, count all the birds, and ideally document how you did it, so we can bring that survey area up to a tier 2 survey, an area search survey. So next time that someone goes, we can have a map and an idea of a route that you're going, and potentially predefined survey areas with boundaries, so you have defined count areas at those individual sites. The third tier is a next step that totally aligns with some of the current flyway protocols, which involve subsampling some of these sites, We won't get to that. I won't dive into that today. We won't get to that at most of these survey sites, at least in the next couple of years in the Intermountain West. But it is essentially methodology that's being used at many of the sites on the coast that allows us to subsample the sites rather than surveying everything, and still gives us the ability to monitor both trends in abundance and species diversity at each site. Quickly, just a visualization of how these look. Our tier 1, we're just going to count birds, count every bird within Mud Lake. This is in Idaho here. So going in, we just have a map and we ask somebody to probably draw where they went and where they actually counted on there and give us a full count of all the different species of birds. Tier 2, we'd go next time and we'd know, okay, maybe we're just counting the whole lake, and there'd also be potentially some a line of good observation points and survey route to do it. And as well, within the tier 2, now that we have a predefined survey area, we can ask the surveyors to at least categorize the habitat type within that survey area, and then also the percentage of the amount of that area that they were actually able to see and count. So it gives us a little more details on the site characteristics and habitat types within the tier 2 survey. This could also be tier 2, where we would break it up into distinct count areas that are based on the size and shape of the lake and accessible areas. So in this case, we'd be having essentially 4 different shorebird counts and habitat characterizations. Tier 3 takes a little bit to the next level, and you'd be subsampling within those larger areas and adding some additional site characteristic protocols. So we won't go into the protocol any deeper. We're going to have some trainings that I'll mention towards the end too, as we lead up to the surveys in 2023 that dig in much deeper on the protocol and survey techniques and species identification as well. So I did mention we had to decide when we were going to survey. And so the National Audubon Society led an analysis of eBird status and trend maps using 26 shorebird species that were encountered on, I think, at least 200 of around 10,000 surveys from the historic survey effort. And they used the area in blue to essentially overlay all of the distribution maps for these 26 species to help us identify 1 week in spring and 2 weeks in fall with the peak abundance across all of those 26 species. And again, we wanted to identify 1 week in spring because we know birds are moving through quicker. There's a much smaller window to take that snapshot. And then we're looking at 2 weeks in fall because we know stopover times are quite a bit longer for most species in fall. So here is an example of the results of that. And as you can see here, this is for the willet, including all of these, the portions of 11 states from the previous slide. And you can see a very steep peak in spring and fall, knowing they're moving through in relatively low numbers and over a very short period of time. So we essentially had a graph like this for each of the species, but then we also combined the species as well to understand here each line is a species and the dotted line is all species summed together essentially. So you can see where we have a very clear peak in spring of these shorebirds moving through the Intermountain West. And so we identified the last week of April, the 24th to the 30th, as our survey window in spring. Definitely more protracted in fall, where we have birds staying quite a long time. We also have a lot more variability in the timing that certain species are moving through. You can see very early peaks here for Wilson's phalaropes, and then more peaks around over the main peak of abundance, which is right in the middle of August, which is where we've targeted our 2 week survey window. And then even later when we have juveniles and Dunlin and a few other of these late moving shorebirds that end up peaking. So at the end of this program, we're really going to look towards creating some qualitative, easy to digest data summaries of distribution and abundance and maps that can really tell the story to many different people in a simplified fashion of what we found, just basic numbers and changes and trends over the past 30 years, and look at that at these different spatial scales. So it's relevant to everyone and different audiences. We're also going to, and part of that will be 2 essential iterations of statistical analyses, one focused on those trends and really under this hypothesis that declines in wetland availability across Intermountain West coincide with similar declines in shorebird populations. There's a lot of data existing out there now that both shorebirds and wetlands are declining, but what is the relative difference? How related are those to change, those changes? And we're also going to do the second iteration, which is taking all of those trends and data and moving that into conservation actions. And mentioned we haven't developed all of the priorities for this because we'll do it collaboratively with the various state wildlife agencies and stakeholders across the West. So this was a little bit on where the Audubon, the National Audubon has been building out a huge portion of our partnership network. Audubon is essentially leading our recruitment of volunteers across the region. And we're working with some other organizations to help with coordination a little bit, but it's primarily Point Blue leading most of the project management and Audubon recruiting volunteers and helping with design at many sites. And they've done this by recruiting through individual state chapters and then also way down to the individual chapter level in most areas. And they're also, this is an idea of our survey spreadsheet. I won't dive into that too much to make sure we have a little bit of time at the end here. So now I wanted to give you some results. I don't have a lot of numbers to show you. And I said, hopefully we can come back at one point and dive into a lot more of our results. But we had our first snapshot survey this past August. We had to focus, focus not entirely on the full region as we're still growing out this huge network, and it's going to take, hopefully by this next April, maybe this next August, where we have visited all sites actually at once. But in this last August, we were able to get to actually 111 of the 208 sites. We had over 200 participants. So just even in that number of the sites, we had well over 200 participants, counted over 350,000 shorebirds. So I mentioned we could only focus on certain sites as we were growing out this program. And you can see the sites that we were able to survey in green, sites that we did not get to in red. We tried to focus more on the core region, California, Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, and Utah. And those are the sites that had the most birds for the most part. So we visited 28 of 38 sites that had more than 1,000 shorebirds on a single survey historically. We also visited all 10 of the 10 sites that had more than 10,000 median count in fall. And as you can guess, we were out there this last August. We found a lot of dry sites, high numbers of dry sites that were small, but also some of these larger sites that we visited were dry as well. Goose Lake and Humboldt Management Wildlife Area being 2 of the 10 that were super important in fall that were entirely dry this past year. Many others were mostly dry. And then you can see a list of a few of the other sites from the 38 list of 38 that were that were completely dry as well. So this will be another aspect of this inventory. We'll be visiting some dry sites and counting 0 birds, but those zeros are super important for this approach. In Utah, we had a full, complete, comprehensive survey of the Great Salt Lake, a massive day there was almost 100 participants covering 60 unique survey areas. And that includes 50 of those, or it's 52, I think, at the Great Salt Lake alone, which required planes, boats, everything, and all hands on deck to cover the Great Salt Lake. They counted over 228,000 shorebirds across 31 species. You can see Phalaropes led the charge by far in total numbers, but over 30,000 American avocets, almost 20,000 blackneck stilts, and 2,000 dowitchers. In Nevada, we were able to cover a handful of the most important sites. We covered the vast majority of sites, and including some of the most important ones. And we covered 43 of, I believe, the 52 sites, including one awesome volunteer that helped cover 12 sites. Some of these areas you can hit several sites in a day. Some you're working with a big team of people just to cover one site. And out of those 43, 18 were completely dry. We also, for the biggest numbers of any site in Nevada, was by far the Lahontan Valley, with over 13,000 shorebirds in total, including primarily avocets and long-billed dowitchers. And you can see the relative importance of the Lahontan Valley just even from these initial data, where they had over 13,000 shorebirds there and less than 5,000 at all of the other sites combined. And huge thanks to some of the Audubon societies that have already made major contributions. So if anybody is listening today, thank you. Here gives an idea of some of the trips through Eastern Nevada, maybe some places you all are pretty familiar with, but there was a lot of searching dry valleys and not finding much water. And that's the photo on the top right is more of a joke, in that they found a little spring. That was about all in the entire valley. So getting these data are challenging, but also super important. And getting into some of our results from California, we also had a nearly comprehensive survey of the Salton Sea access, and the partner network there is quite a bit different than the Great Salt Lake, but we had over 15 participants and counted over 50,000 shorebirds, which, you remember, it was over 230, I think, from the Great Salt Lake. So the second highest site being the Salton Sea at 50,000. We're looking forward to April and aiming for a full survey of the Great Salt Lake, now that we can actually get boats into the water there, where the Salton Sea has receded so far that the state of California just finally built a new boat ramp, because it had been almost entirely inaccessible to boats for the last 6 or 7 years. We also had a big day at Mono Lake, one of the other most important sites, where 23 participants walked 45 miles of the shoreline to completely circumnavigate the whole shoreline, and also complemented by a boat survey in the open water, and counted over 26,000 shorebirds, including over 13,000 redneck phalaropes, and you can see almost 5,000 American avocets. Goose Lake was a pretty depressing survey. That was actually me, and I took this picture. But going that entire area, the entire portion of Goose Lake, there was not much besides a few little springs that were trampled by cattle in that entire area that was once really, really important for migratory shorebirds, and now has not had any water in several years. Although I'd imagine there's some there, a little bit there right now. Hopefully it'll last until the spring for the birds. And into Oregon, we really focused on the Sonic region and some of the key sites. At Upper Klamath Basin, we counted over 7,000 shorebirds. The distribution of habitat and birds has changed a lot in the Klamath Basin in the past 30 years, with different water agreements. And now we have refuges in the southern part of the basin that are completely dry. But on the northern part of the basin in Oregon, it's a different story. There's a little bit more water now, in part because of water agreements related to endangered fish. We also still had impacts this past August from COVID, and could continue even into 2023. We had to cancel our boat survey of Upper Klamath Lake. We also had to cancel aerial surveys at about 10 additional sites, which is another reason we didn't get to some in Nevada, was because our pilot caught COVID and our boat driver caught COVID too. So going into this massive effort, we know we're not, in reality, even once we have all the sites online, we're not going to probably survey them all for each season for one reason or another. We also missed some surveys in Arizona. The only ones we had scheduled were trying to cover the lower Colorado River National Wildlife Refuge Complex. And the day before our boat surveys, there was a big thunderstorm, and that canceled those surveys with fires on the actual refuges. And we were pretty lucky with smoke this past August, and there was very little smoke across Intermountain West overall, but we don't expect that to necessarily hold in future years. So looking forward a little bit, we have into this next year, which will really be our first full year of shorebird surveys. We're really looking to build out or maintain and also build out our network of participants, being observers to help with shorebird surveys, and then also all of the other people it takes to really pull this off, which is often supporters within different organizational management offices, or just people on the ground to get us access to sites. So it's a huge number of people that we really have to engage to pull this off. We need to really expand into particular Washington, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Arizona. And ideally, we're able to fill in at least get the first visit to all of the sites by spring 2023. We'll also be creating a GIS mapping centralized location that will have all the sites and then available to share online as well. And as part of that, that will eventually evolve into a data visualization tool that within a year or two from now, we hope to have real-time results online overlaid with actual surface water distributions, so we can visualize survey results and potentially water distributions as their habitat on the same map on an online data viewer. That will be part of this research phase that I mentioned that we're looking to secure funding from right now. So just to end here, I know we have a few minutes left, but how you can help, we need skilled volunteers as lead observers across the region. It could be in Nevada, it could be in really any state. We will have some returning volunteers that will get priority for sites that they had surveyed in the previous season. We have many needs in a lot of different locations for people to travel locally or far, and we're really looking for folks that have the ability to ID shorebirds and ideally ID shorebirds to the species level, even the hard ones, because a distinction between Western and least sandpiper can be really important from a conservation standpoint. Those birds have considerably different ecology and how they're using the landscape, the timings of their movements and breeding and habitats, so habitat use. So even getting down that species level is really important. If you're not quite that great, that's okay. We can still use your help. We can put people together in teams. We're going to have trainings on both the protocol, survey techniques, and then also a little bit on shorebird identification. We will mostly be sharing a whole package of resources because there's a lot out there online, and we're not going to reinvent the wheel in some of the identification webinars that are out there. As I mentioned, even if you don't have shorebird or bird ID experience, you can help as a data recorder or driver. We are offering mileage reimbursements for volunteers as well. The only thing you really need to be an observer are, in addition to these skills, are some transportation and then a scope and binoculars. If you need optics, we can help you find some as well. So it's not, we can help on that end. And then we have a list of some other small things that we'll have everyone bring in the field as well, but I won't dive into that this evening. Other ways you can help, you can join our email list for anything. If you're interested in volunteering, join the email list. Please email me. You see my email at the bottom of the slide there. Also, please follow our different partner organizations on social media. Follow or check out Point Blue, Audubon, the Sageline Collaborative, Great Basin Bird Observatory. We're partnering with Western state wildlife agencies across the West, the Intermountain West Joint Venture. There's a lot of great follows to keep track of wetland change and conservation, and also better understand these birds that are relying on these really unique and imperiled habitats. And if you're into social media, the hashtag shorebirds count. As we get into each survey season, we will ask volunteers if they're sharing any information or pictures to keep that hashtag on there, so we can find find everyone's great stories and see the survey through their eyes. So I'll end now with just a quick thank you. This is not a comprehensive list here by any means, but this is a massive, massive effort. And we have probably built out the partnership network to around 70% at this point. So we expect this partner list to grow considerably over the next year or so. But it takes, as I mentioned, it takes an army, and we couldn't even list all of the program participants, as we already had well over 200, as I mentioned. So that's all the content I have for today. I know we might have a few minutes for any questions or open discussion if we had some.
Thanks, Blake. That was awesome. I know a few of us here at GBBO are pretty excited to get out for some shorebird surveys this year. So it's nice to learn more about the program. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please type it into the chat and we'll hang out for a couple minutes and answer those questions.
Well, I have some questions. Sorry I'm late, and thanks again, Blake. I really appreciated the presentation. It was really interesting to hear about, and cool that we'll be helping out on some of the surveys this coming spring. I like the citizen science aspect of it is very cool, and I appreciate that that push. I think that's a really awesome to get everybody engaged and involved in that way. I like that the project is going that direction. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it's pulling off a survey at this scale is really the only way is using all available resources and really relying a lot on the unskilled birders and other folks across the region that have this really helpful knowledge and skills. And we have taken this approach also relying not only on volunteers, but some, professional biologists and ecologists like at Great Basin Bird Observatory, in part replicating our programs that have been ongoing now for over 10 years in mostly coastal areas. And it's been interesting building out this program in Intermountain West and seeing, okay, like how is this ratio of citizen scientists and staff and biologists, like, is it going to be similar? Are we going to need more volunteers than we think? Are we going to need more biologists than we think? Going in, most people thought we need a whole heck of a lot more biologists just because of the remoteness of a lot of the sites. And I think they've really underestimated the drive of a lot of people to contribute to conservation. And it's really inspiring to get to interact with so many great and knowledgeable people, many that have a lot better birding skills than myself.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think the birding community has sort of a long history of being connected with academia and research and science. I was just thinking about this recently, possibly a little more so than other hobbies and even other naturalists. So I think the birding community is it's cool to see people stepping up like that, like you say. I was a little late to join, but when I first jumped on, you were talking about awe and inspiring, and I don't know if that was in the context of public outreach engagement or not, but I think shorebirds are a taxa that definitely have the capacity to inspire awe just from the sheer numbers you see in some places.
Right, that's I don't remember exactly the context, but one of the key developments as we go into this more second and research phase of this massive program is really building out the communications aspect of that. And right, shorebirds they're incredible world travelers. Many of them, they take journeys that are inspiring and are really just mind-blowing in a lot of ways. They're living in, they're birds that you often have to go out of your way to see, right? Because they're really specialized. Many of them, if not most of them, are pretty specialized in what they're looking for habitat, and they can also find it over vast scales. So if you build it, they will come pretty quickly. If there's water, they will find it. They're able to locate habitat at this massive spatial scale. And we think they're pretty, they're flexible, but part of this program is to better understand that and understand how are these birds adapting? How is their distribution changed when we know some of these really important wetlands are no longer there for them? And we have, there is an assumption by some people that, well, right, birds can fly and they can find the habitat, but they're clear. Our intuition says there's probably costs to that one way or the other, and being able to both understand the costs, but then also understanding how the populations are behaving and how they're distributing among the habitats and among the different habitat types at these different sites can be really, really important to help practitioners understand how they're prioritizing investments and restoration moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes me think of, well, several questions I had jotted down throughout the presentation. But first off, since you mentioned the journeys and the places they're going, is there any modus component or thought or talk of that in the future? It seems like plotting where these, I guess being mindful of that, a lot of these water bodies potentially don't have long futures, like you mentioned, the sad state of affairs at Goose Lake, some of these other really shallow saline lakes and inland wetlands that are, the water levels are decreasing and decreasing. So yeah, I don't know, interesting to see the birds' response to this. Like, are they going to find other inland locations? Are they going to gravitate towards coastal locations where there's more guaranteed of water? I mean, these birds are all specialized to certain habitat characteristics, which are obviously not always met by the ocean or other bodies of water. But in order to sort of categorize and get at that response, I don't know how, I guess just sort of thinking about that, like where are they?
Right. Yeah, well, there's more of like a direct connectivity between sites aspect of research that's not within the scope of this current program. There are some existing programs. Some of the research that we're leading in with the state of California is really trying to understand the impacts of drought and variable amounts of habitat on the landscape. Part of that is understanding their physiology, where we're collecting blood samples from both wintering and migrating shorebirds to better understand like what is their actual body condition. So we're taking a lot additional morphometrics, the body measurements, but then also these blood samples to have physiological analyses to look at things like corticosterone levels, oxidative stress, some other more new techniques that I'm not even very familiar with that a lab at Oregon State is going to lead to understand and see if we can find like actual signs of stress in these birds, depending on the different habitat, the different extents of habitat that they've been experiencing. Part of that is also tagging birds as well, using the MODIS network that's rapidly expanding. So right now we're tagging a lot of Dunlin and long-billed dowitchers in California. The MODIS network is expanding much more rapidly on the west side of the Sierras and Cascades than it is on the east right now. There will be efforts, though, I know in the next few years to start tagging phalaropes at Mono Lake. So they're going to start tracking phalaropes from Mono Lake, putting up MODIS towers also at Great Salt Lake and a few of the other saline lakes as well. And I would anticipate that the USGS is likely going to be investing in research regarding connectivity among the saline lakes over the next few years as part of the large saline lakes program and monitoring program that they're developing.
Cool. Yeah, very, very powerful technology. Very, very cool stuff. Right.
They just finally got some of the GPS tags down to the size to put on long-billed dowitchers as well. So that's some research that
very cool.
We're starting just this year, and hopefully hope to expand that a little bit more. I think it'd be really great to tag dowitchers, particularly in Nevada, and understand their use, as we know they're really early arriving shorebirds, right? They're coming down, dowitchers are coming down to rely on wetlands across Western US and in July and August. So they're really experiencing some of this extreme drought that's been pretty much annual now for many years. They're experiencing it longer than a lot of the other birds too. So really interested to know how the drought and these more extreme conditions are impacting their migratory decisions, right? Are they coming back to the same spots, and how long are they stopping over these spots, depending on the water conditions.
Yeah, the dowitcher in Nevada is an interesting example because I can't remember the exact numbers. I remember semi-recently reading a piece in Western Birds about the shorebird use of the Lahontan Valley in Nevada, and there was a pretty significant chunk, I want to say population level significant chunk of long-billed dowitchers using the central Nevada wetland complexes.
Right, Lahontan Valley in particular
Yeah.
I used to have a disproportionate amount of dowitchers using it. I think it's still relatively high for dowitchers, but that will be one of the things we'll find in this program is the understanding that relative value of a place like the Lahontan Valley, and just the relative potential declines in dowitcher populations as their dowitchers were just noted as, I believe, on the brink in the State of the Birds, which was some of the first real harder science coming out identifying dowitchers as having some really steep declines. And intuitively it makes a lot of sense for a lot of the reasons I just mentioned, is these birds are relying on interior wetlands that have been decimated in recent decades. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there any like quantification of available habitat, like with the shorebird data being collected? Is there any sort of, like, I know you're mentioning in the protocol a little bit of, they mentioned the area they covered, but is there any sort of like actual quantification of area covered to get at any sort of, I guess density component for the birds, but also just like available habitat? Like, are there using the habitat disproportionately to what's available to get at preferences or site character? Like, is there any of that data collection going on? I think your reaction is going to be like, we have a hard enough time finding volunteers to collect the data we are, but
well,
the scientist in me can't help but wonder more.
Well, the short answer is yes. And so we're working with the Intermountain West joint venture, who has created a wetland evaluation tool. So they have an entire system to download, process, and create GIS layer maps of surface water distributions in almost real time. So the Intermountain West joint venture is going to be taking on the habitat aspect of the program, which is really not a big ask because they already have the system in place. And essentially we can just take, we can easily acquire data from both at the sites for these shorebird sites at the site level, but then also at these different spatial scales as well. So the bird data is the hard part. The habitat data is actually the easy part because of all of the hard work that the Intermountain West joint venture has put in to create the system to monitor wetlands and surface water distribution across the Intermountain West. So
very cool.
In part, where this massive partnership at work is relying on a lot of help, and they're really excited and interested to help take it to the next level, because we know shorebird distributions are related to water, and that's going to be the most important driver or the most correlated likely driver of their distributions. But there's a lot of other things we want to look at potentially in some areas at different scales, including restoration and potentially some different management practices. It's pretty interesting talking to different refuges and managers of wetlands, and a lot of them say, like, we manage a lot different than we did 10 or 15 years ago or 20 years ago. So they're, just management regimes shift and change in a lot of ways. Some of them are more beneficial for shorebirds and others not. So it's interesting to learn how that has changed over time as well.
Yeah, and that'll be cool to see that take as the years go on and more data collected the following years. It'll be cool to see that pattern take shape, and correlate that with differences in management practices.
Right. As maybe I mentioned, we will, with Intermountain West joint venture, hopefully within, maybe 2 years, if not a little less from now, have a data visualization tool where you can pull up essentially a Google Earth map and and overlay that with surface water, and then also have the bird data from
Oh,
our
very cool.
surveys available on there as well. So
Oh, cool.
that'll be available in more real time, where right you can see the distribution of water and see how many birds we were counting at these sites. And we see that as a really big tool for communicating to everyone, everyone at home, and then also all the way up into management offices and federal and state agencies.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really cool. I'm looking forward to being able to check that out. I know I'll be getting out in excuse me, in April to do some surveys myself. So I'm looking forward to that, to contributing to the project.
Yeah, thank you so much for
That would be fun.
that.
I think Kayla's going to get out and do some surveys as well.
I think I am not sure exactly what's in store for me yet, but I did some last year, and it was really fun to get out and do. So I'm looking forward to it if I can.
Nice.
I'm not seeing any other questions coming into the chat, so might be about time to wrap it up for tonight. But yeah, great questions, Ned, and thanks again, Blake, for your time and for presenting for us and telling us more about the Shorebird program. So this presentation will be, it was recorded, and we will upload it to our YouTube channel. We have all of our socials listed here, as well as our YouTube, which is just Great Basin Bird Observatory. So be on the lookout for it there. And yeah, thanks again, everybody, for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Cool. Thank you, Kayla, and thank you, Blake. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.
Michelle.